Have you ever trusted someone or something when every voice around you said not to? What if the greatest protector of your child was not a person, but a silent guardian others feared? Today's story will take you deep into a bond few understand, but all will feel. It is more than a tale about a dog and a child. It is a journey about choice, loyalty, and the power of silent love. Stay with us until the end. What you are about to witness holds a lesson deeper than instinct, a truth about sacrifice and family that might just change the way you see the world. Sometimes, the most extraordinary protectors walk on four legs and speak with their eyes. Where the land folds into itself beneath the towering pines of Bridger-Teton National Forest, where mountains stretch their shadows across weathered fences and the wind speaks in the hush of aspen leaves, a woman stood watching the light fade behind her wooden cabin. The world was quiet here, quiet in a way that made grief easier to breathe, if not to escape. Rachel Moore had never imagined she would end up in a place like this. A year ago, her life had followed a different rhythm, a sharper, faster one filled with city streets and K9 units, sirens, schedules, and someone waiting for her at the end of each shift. That someone had been Noah, her husband of nearly 8 years, a fellow officer with a quick laugh and a quiet bravery that made her believe in things she hadn't dared hope for after childhood. Then the accident had taken him. A single call, a wrong place, a wrong time. Just like that, she'd gone from wife to widow. Now, she lived at the edge of the forest, far from the noise, in a modest timber cabin built by Noah's grandfather, a place they'd once planned to visit during retirement. Instead, it became her refuge much too soon. She lived here now with her 18-month-old daughter Sophie, and a dog who, like her, carried a kind of sadness in his bones. Titan. He was a pit bull with a coat the color of riverstone and a gaze that never quite softened, even in sleep. Rachel had trained dozens of dogs during her years as a K9 officer, but none had been like Titan. He was a legend at the unit, not because he was the biggest or the fastest, but because he was utterly fearless. During a hostage rescue operation 2 years ago, he had dragged a wounded officer to safety under fire. But that same operation had cost him the partner he'd trusted most, Officer Luis Garza, the man who'd raised him from a puppy. Luis had died in the blast that followed the extraction. Titan survived with shrapnel buried in his leg and a change in his soul that no surgery could reach. After the funeral, he refused food for days, growled at handlers, and barked into corners as if looking for someone who was no longer there. He was retired, deemed too unstable for further service. No one volunteered to take him home, not even the officers who'd once admired his bravery. Rachel had. She hadn't known exactly why. Grief recognizes itself, perhaps. She saw something in Titan's stillness that mirrored her own. That heavy, quiet watching. That guarded silence. And she thought, maybe if we can't fix each other, we can at least survive together. It wasn't easy. Titan didn't bark unnecessarily. He didn't beg for treats or nuzzle her hand. He didn't wag his tail when she came home with groceries or when Sophie cried at night. Instead, he sat, observed, protected, always near, always silent. He stayed 3 feet from Sophie's crib each night, moving only when she woke. He never let her out of his sight during the day. It was as if the part of him that once ran into danger had now decided its final duty was simply to stay. Just stay. Rachel watched him from the porch that evening, the soft creak of the swing beneath her, and Sophie's small weight pressed against her chest. The baby had fallen asleep with one hand curled in Rachel's shirt and the other dangling, relaxed, toward the dog who sat at the bottom of the steps. Titan didn't sleep much. At least not deeply. His ears twitched at distant rustles, his eyes scanning the tree line like he expected trouble to rise out of the dusk. She didn't mind. She didn't mind the silence. It made her feel less alone, somehow. There was a kind of holiness in how the wilderness pressed in around them, as if it understood that healing had to come in whispers, not declarations. Sometimes Rachel walked the narrow trails behind the house while Sophie napped in her stroller and Titan padded silently beside them. She didn't speak much during those walks. She just listened. To birdsong, to branches cracking, to her own slow heart rebuilding itself. She knew there were people who would never understand why she kept Titan near her child. A pit bull, a retired working dog with battle scars and trauma in his blood. But Rachel had always trusted instinct over reputation. Titan had never once shown aggression to Sophie. If anything, his loyalty bordered on reverence. There was something ancient in the way he watched the baby, like a knight who had failed one king and vowed never to fail again. Rachel shifted Sophie in her arms and looked at the horizon, at the way the last light painted the tips of the trees gold. She didn't know what would come next. She only knew that in this quiet place, with this unlikely dog and her daughter, she had carved out something worth preserving. Maybe not peace. Not yet. But something close. She whispered into the fading sky, more to herself than anyone else. We're still here. Titan didn't move, but she felt his gaze lift, a connection not built on commands or obedience, but on something older. Grief, faith, the simple decision to stay present when walking away would have been easier. And that was the thing about bridges between humans and animals. They weren't built in the easy moments. They were forged in silence, in proximity, in nights when no one else came through the door. The wild began where fences ended, but sometimes the wild stepped in, laid down at your feet and stayed. Not tamed, just chosen. And on that quiet evening, Rachel knew. Titan had chosen them. It was the kind of summer afternoon that made everything feel still. The wind was warm, the trees held their breath, and even the hummingbirds seemed to hover in silence. The sun stretched long golden fingers across the backyard of Rachel Moore's quiet cabin, touching the weathered fence posts and casting slow-moving shadows across the patchy grass. Sophie was sitting on a quilted blanket in the middle of the yard, surrounded by brightly colored toys that she had more fun throwing than playing with. Her baby laughter drifted through the open kitchen window as Rachel stood at the counter, sorting the freshly laundered towels she'd pulled from the dryer. The rhythmic creak of the wind chimes and the far-off call of a hawk were the only sounds that filled the air. Just a few feet away from Sophie, Titan lay under the shade of a young birch tree. His massive body was still, his head resting on his front paws, eyes half-lidded but alert. That was how Titan always rested. Never fully asleep, never completely relaxed. He tracked the baby with a quiet intensity, as if every breath she took was a note in some invisible symphony he had sworn to protect. Rachel glanced out the window again. Everything looked perfectly normal, peaceful even. Titan hadn't moved, and Sophie was now chewing on a stuffed rabbit's ear while talking to a plastic cup. It was only going to take 60 seconds, maybe even less. She left the kitchen and crossed into the laundry room just off the back hallway. The basket of clean clothes sat waiting by the door. Rachel knelt, folding little onesies and the soft flannel pajamas Sophie loved, her mind already drifting toward dinner plans. Maybe grilled chicken, or leftovers from yesterday's stew. She wasn't even gone a full minute. But that was all it took. From outside came a sound that snapped her upright, a low, throaty growl, followed by a bark that was neither loud nor panicked, but sharp. Urgent. Titan. Rachel dropped the towel in her hands and bolted toward the door. Her heart pounded as she ran barefoot across the wooden floor and flung the screen door open. The world outside had changed. Sophie was no longer on the blanket. She was a few feet away, on her back in the grass, her arms flailing in confusion. Just beyond her, Titan was a blur of motion, his massive frame wedged between her and something that sent ice through Rachel's veins. A bobcat. It was lean, dusty-furred, and crouched low, its yellow eyes wide and fixed on Titan. Its body was coiled, muscles twitching, mouth drawn back in a silent snarl. Rachel didn't even have time to scream before it lunged. Titan met the creature mid-air. The two animals collided with a force that shook the ground, a furious tangle of fur and fury. Rachel ran toward Sophie, snatching the baby up in her arms and backing away, just as Titan was thrown hard against the fence. The bobcat leapt again, claws slashing, catching Titan across the face. Rachel screamed, searching for something, anything, nearby to use. Her hands landed on the long-handled broom propped against the porch. She didn't think, didn't hesitate. With Sophie in one arm and adrenaline in her blood, she rushed forward and swung the broom hard, catching the bobcat across its side. It hissed, twisted in midair, and bolted through a gap in the far fence. Gone. Just like that. Titan collapsed to the ground. Rachel rushed to him, Sophie crying against her shoulder. The dog was lying on his side, panting hard, blood matting the left side of his face. One of his front legs twitched, then went still. He didn't bark. He didn't whimper. He just looked at Rachel. And that was when she saw it. His jaws were still locked around the hem of Sophie's tiny t-shirt. Not biting, not hurting, just holding. Gently, as if he'd been dragging her to safety before collapsing. Rachel knelt beside him, heart hammering, tears clouding her vision. She reached down to touch his head, and he released the fabric. His breathing was shallow, and blood stained the grass beneath him. For a long moment, Rachel couldn't speak. She had been just one day, one decision, away from giving Titan up. Only the evening before, she had sat on the porch after putting Sophie to bed, staring at the adoption papers from a reputable rescue group 3 towns over. She'd convinced herself it was for Sophie's safety. That no matter how gentle Titan had been, he was still a powerful dog, a retired K9 with trauma in his past, and a bite history from years on the job. She had even filled out the form, but she hadn't signed it. Something had stopped her. A feeling. Maybe guilt. Maybe the way Titan always sat by Sophie's crib until she fell asleep. Or the way his ears perked when she babbled nonsense. Or maybe she just wasn't ready to say goodbye to the only soul who knew what loss felt like the way she did. Now Titan had almost died protecting the very child she had doubted he could safely live beside. Rachel cradled Sophie tighter and whispered to Titan, "You held on. You didn't let her go." His eyes fluttered closed for a second, then opened again. Tired. Fading, she knew he needed help. Fast. Without wasting another second, Rachel scooped him up the best she could, his 35-pound frame awkward in her arms as Sophie clung to her neck. She carried him to the truck and laid him in the back seat on a blanket, her hands slick with blood and shaking. As she slammed the door and jumped behind the wheel, she looked in the rearview mirror at the 2 beings who made up her whole world. One barely conscious, the other blinking up at her with tears on her cheeks and grass in her hair. 60 seconds. That's all it took to change everything. And now Rachel knew. Some choices weren't just about safety. They were about love. About faith. About trusting the bond that defied instinct, history, and fear. Titan had made his choice. Now it was Rachel's turn to fight for him. The drive to Dr. Lanford's clinic was only 35 minutes, but to Rachel, it felt like a lifetime stretched thin between hope and heartbreak. The truck rumbled over gravel roads as the late afternoon light faded into the deep blue hush of early evening. She gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white, every glance in the rearview mirror stabbing through her like a needle. Titan lay across a folded quilt in the back seat, his head resting on the floor mat, his body still except for the shallow rise and fall of his chest. One eye was swollen shut, the other just barely open, watching her. Barely. Sophie buckled into her car seat beside him, reached out her small hand toward the edge of the blanket. She didn't cry anymore. Her wide eyes stayed fixed on the dog who had, just an hour before, stood between her and a wild predator. Her lips moved slowly, forming a shape that startled Rachel to her core. Tatan. It was the first time she had heard her daughter try to speak his name. Rachel felt something crumble inside her. Tears blurred the road ahead, but she couldn't stop to wipe them away. Not now. Not when time was slipping through her fingers. Titan had saved her child. He had bled for her. And all Rachel could think about was how close, how heartbreakingly close, she had come to giving him up. She had almost sent him away. Just one more signature, and he would have been gone. Rehomed, forgotten, all because of fear. All because of the what-ifs that clung to her ever since Noah died. She had tried to protect Sophie the only way she knew how, by controlling every variable. But some things couldn't be controlled. Some things had to be trusted. And Titan had never betrayed that trust. The memory hit her like the flashback of a nightmare. That night in the forest, the smoke so thick she couldn't breathe, her radio dead, her flashlight flickering. Noah had been on the trail earlier that day, looking for signs of a stranded hiker. When Rachel went after him and lightning struck the ridge, a wildfire sparked faster than anyone predicted. She remembered the heat licking the trees. The roar of flames chasing her footsteps. She'd gotten lost, disoriented. Overwhelmed by smoke and panic. And then, out of nowhere, Titan. He had appeared like something summoned by sheer will. His vest was half burned, his left side scraped raw. But he pushed through the fire toward her, teeth clamped on the strap of her jacket. He had pulled her to safety, inch by inch, until they reached the trailhead. Her husband hadn't made it. But Titan had brought her home. She hadn't told anyone about that night, not even the full story. People would say she imagined it. That adrenaline made things blurry. But she remembered. The strength in that dog's jaws. The look in his eyes as he refused to leave her behind. And now he lay dying on a blanket in her truck, because once again, he had run toward danger to bring someone she loved back from the edge. "Hang on, Titan," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You don't get to leave us. Not like this." The headlights illuminated the modest clinic at the base of the hill. A familiar silhouette stood waiting outside the door. Dr. Lanford, tall and lean, his silver hair catching the porch light. He had treated Titan after the fire, had followed his slow recovery with the quiet patience of someone who understood that not all injuries left visible scars. Rachel barely stopped the truck before she jumped out, flinging open the back door. "He's in bad shape," she called out, her voice thick with panic. "He was attacked. His leg is torn up." "I think he's going into shock." Dr. Lanford moved quickly, a gurney already in place. With practiced care, he and Rachel lifted Titan from the seat and laid him gently down. Sophie whimpered as they carried him inside, her small hand reaching toward him until he was out of sight. In the sterile white of the treatment room, Rachel stood off to the side, holding Sophie against her chest, rocking gently as if to calm herself more than the baby. She watched as Dr. Lanford examined Titan, murmuring to his assistant, checking vitals, applying pressure to the worst of the wounds. "He's lost a lot of blood," the doctor said quietly, "but the wounds aren't too deep. No arterial spray. It's the shock we have to watch. That and infection." Rachel nodded, unable to speak. Dr. Lanford paused and looked over his shoulder at her. "You know," he said gently, "I always believed this dog had more heart than most people I know. But even I didn't think he'd go this far for a child." Rachel found her voice shaky and low. "I was going to send him away," she admitted. "I was scared. I thought maybe he was too damaged, too much." She brushed a tear from Sophie's cheek. But today, he wasn't too much. He was just enough. Sophie reached out again, as if she somehow understood. "Tatan," she said once more, softer this time, as if it were a secret she was sharing with the quiet room. Lanford gave a small, understanding smile. "You've got a fighter," he said, "and I've seen him come back from worse. Let's give him every chance." Rachel nodded, tears falling freely now, and in that moment, standing there with her daughter in her arms, with the dog who had saved them both fighting for breath on a clinic table, Rachel understood something profound. Forgiveness wasn't just something you gave to others. Sometimes it was something you had to give yourself. She had doubted. She had faltered. But Titan hadn't, and she would not let him go down alone. Titan didn't wake for 18 hours. The night passed slowly, in breathless stretches of time, measured only by the steady drip of IV fluids and the soft beeping of monitors in the corner of the clinic room. Rachel sat in the stiff plastic chair next to his kennel, one hand resting lightly on the cool metal bars, the other cradling Sophie, who had finally drifted to sleep, with her cheek pressed against Rachel's collarbone. Outside, the Wyoming forest lay in stillness. It was well past midnight when Rachel's eyes began to close, her head tilting toward her shoulder, body heavy with exhaustion. She didn't know she'd dozed off until a tiny movement stirred her awake. It wasn't much, just the softest of shuffles inside the kennel. Rachel blinked into the dim glow of the overhead light. Titan hadn't opened his eyes, but his paw had moved slightly, a faint twitch against the fleece padding beneath him. Sophie stirred in her sleep. And then, as if drawn by some unspoken urge, she reached out the small stuffed bear that hadn't left her side since she was born and pushed it through the bars of the kennel. It fell next to Titan's shoulder, resting against his blood-matted fur. His tail didn't wag. His breathing didn't quicken, but his paw curled, just slightly, around the toy. Rachel covered her mouth with her hand. It was nothing, and yet everything. The next few days passed in a haze of quiet worry and cautious hope. Titan remained weak, drifting in and out of sleep, refusing food, but accepting the warm broth Rachel brought in with trembling hands. Dr. Lanford said the worst seemed behind them, but they would have to watch closely for signs of infection or internal damage. Rachel didn't leave his side. Neither did Sophie. Each morning she would toddle into the clinic holding a coloring book or block toy, sitting near the kennel and babbling softly as if reading to him. Titan, for his part, never moved much. But his eyes would open when Sophie's voice filled the room. He would watch her, still and solemn, like a sentinel locked in place. It was during the third night home that Rachel noticed the first strange thing. It was just after 3 in the morning when she awoke to a single, sharp bark, loud, direct, echoing down the hallway from the living room. She sat bolt upright in bed. Sophie, asleep beside her in the co-sleeper crib, didn't stir. Rachel slipped out of bed, heart pounding, and moved silently down the hallway. There was Titan, sitting upright in his recovery pen by the back patio door, ears forward, gaze fixed toward the dark window beyond the curtain. "Titan?" she whispered, flipping on the lamp. He turned briefly at her voice, then back to the door. But there was nothing. No shadows. No sounds. Rachel stayed awake for another hour, watching, listening. Nothing stirred. Finally, she returned to bed. The next night again, at exactly 3, another bark. This time louder, almost urgent. Rachel woke immediately and checked outside with a flashlight, scanning the yard. Still nothing. Just trees. Grass. The normal night. By the 4th night, it happened again. Same time, same direction, same stillness afterward. Rachel's exhaustion was replaced with unease. She trusted Titan. She had spent years watching him detect explosives hidden inside abandoned vehicles, tracking missing persons through miles of desert. If he barked, there was a reason. So this time, she waited for morning and decided to search the perimeter. It was Sophie's giggle that first brought her attention to the old stone well behind the garden shed. The well hadn't been used in years. It had long since dried up and had been covered with a thick wooden lid and rusted nails. But just a few feet away, near the base of the fence, Rachel noticed a trail. It wasn't obvious. Just flattened grass and a few marks in the dirt. Thin, winding lines that didn't quite look like prints. She followed them to the corner of the yard, near a half-buried drainage grate. It was old, left over from a previous irrigation system, and had long since been forgotten. Rachel bent down and peered inside. She barely had time to react before she saw it, coiled in the shadows, still as stone, a rattlesnake. She stepped back, heart pounding, adrenaline washing over her. The snake had likely made the drain its passage into the yard, its hunting trail looping quietly just feet from where Sophie often played. And somehow, Titan had known. Even injured. Even weak. He had sensed it. That night, Rachel installed motion sensors around the perimeter and reinforced the old grate with steel mesh. She added a second layer of fencing near the play area and ordered snake repellents online. As the sun went down, she sat beside Titan's pen, a cup of tea growing cold in her hand, staring out at the horizon with a mix of awe and something like reverence. He hadn't barked at random. He wasn't just alert, he had warned them. Again. Rachel reached through the pen, her fingers brushing the edge of his paw. "You don't have to do all this," she whispered. "You're not on duty anymore." Titan didn't move, but his eyes opened slowly, steady and calm. "I get it now," she said quietly. "You're not just doing your job. You're protecting what you chose." It was a strange feeling, somewhere between gratitude and humility. She had spent so long believing that loyalty came from training, that protection was just an extension of instinct and repetition. But this was something else. It was deeper. Older. Titan wasn't acting out of reflex. He was acting out of connection. He had chosen Sophie. He had chosen this family. And every night, even when his body ached and the scars throbbed, he would bark at 3 a.m. to remind them that danger was near, and that he was still watching. Rachel leaned her head against the kennel's edge, tears stinging her eyes. She had believed herself the rescuer in this story. But more and more, she was starting to see the truth. She wasn't saving Titan. Titan was saving them. Every single night. The first signs of Titan's recovery weren't dramatic. There was no miraculous leap to his feet, no sudden bark of triumph. Instead, it began with the smallest things. An ear that twitched when Sophie's laughter rang through the living room, the shift of his tail when Rachel opened a can of chicken broth, the way his eyes followed them as they moved about the cabin. His body still bore the weight of the fight. His front leg, where the bobcat had torn through flesh and muscle, healed with a stiffness that made every step a slow, uneven effort. He limped now, sometimes heavily, but his gaze, that had changed. His eyes were brighter, not in the gleaming way of youth or excitement, but in a calmer, deeper sense, like something inside him had been touched and awakened, not just by survival, but by purpose. Dr. Lanford came to check on him every other day, never staying long, but always leaving behind some bit of wisdom as quietly as he'd arrived. One afternoon, after checking Titan's reflexes and rewrapping the final dressing on his leg, the doctor stood back, arms folded. "There are dogs that protect because they were trained to," he said, voice low, more thought than statement. "Then there are dogs like Titan, who protect because something inside them tells them to. Not duty, not command, just heart." Rachel didn't answer at first. She was crouched beside Titan, brushing a gentle hand over the top of his head. He leaned into the touch without hesitation. There was no tension in his posture anymore, no flinch or guarded stiffness, just presence. "I used to think he needed saving," she said quietly. "But I think he's the one who saved us." Dr. Lanford gave a knowing nod and left it at that. Inside the house, the days unfolded in a rhythm that was both ordinary and extraordinary. Sophie had begun to walk, first in bursts, then in determined stumbles. She clung to furniture, then fingers, then the air itself as she took off across the living room like a tiny explorer. But what surprised Rachel most wasn't that Sophie was walking. It was who she chose to walk to. Not her mother, not her toys, but Titan. The old pit bull would lie on the rug, watching with those amber eyes, unmoving except for the occasional flick of his tail. Sophie, giggling, arms outstretched, would waddle toward him, squealing with joy when she reached him and collapsing into a pile beside his massive body. He never reacted the way a pet might. He didn't roll over or nuzzle her face. He just allowed her. And somehow, that quiet acceptance made the moment more profound. It wasn't affection in the traditional sense. It was trust. Mutual, wordless trust. Sometimes Rachel would catch Titan watching Sophie from across the room, not just supervising, but studying her, memorizing her movements, her habits, her patterns, as if he were constantly building a mental map of the one creature he had decided mattered most in the world. And Sophie, for her part, grew braver beside him. She had always been a cautious child, shy with strangers, sensitive to noise. But near Titan, something in her opened. She would babble to him for hours, telling stories in the language of toddlers and dreams. She would place her tiny hand on his back and walk alongside him, balancing herself with the gravity of his presence. Rachel watched it all with a sense of reverence she couldn't fully explain. She had trained military dogs, worked in tactical units, seen canines perform miracles in high-pressure situations. But this quiet companionship between her daughter and a broken dog, it was unlike anything she had ever known. One evening, just before sunset, Rachel stepped outside with Sophie on her hip. The sky burned with streaks of orange and violet, casting long shadows across the cabin's backyard. Titan followed them out, limping slightly, but moving steadily. Sophie squirmed to be put down. Rachel set her on the grass and watched as the little girl toddled straight toward Titan, who had settled beneath the old birch tree near the fence. She plopped down beside him, pulling her teddy bear from under her arm and placing it gently between them. Titan looked at the bear, then at Sophie. She smiled and patted his paw. Rachel leaned against the porch railing, arms folded, eyes glassy. No words had passed between them. None were needed. It was a moment woven together with threads unseen. Pain endured, trust earned, love given without condition. There were days when Rachel still mourned Noah, still questioned the decisions she made, still feared the unknowns that lay ahead for her daughter in a world that could be unpredictable and unkind. But in that moment, watching Titan and Sophie share silence beneath a tree, she felt something stronger than fear. She felt peace. Because sometimes, the fiercest guardians make no sound. They just stay. They just choose. And Titan had chosen Sophie. No orders, no leash. No reward. Only love. The morning Rachel's mother arrived, the air smelled like rain, though the sky was clear. A soft breeze carried the scent of pine through the open windows, ruffling the curtains in the kitchen. Rachel stood at the counter, slicing apples for Sophie's breakfast. Titan rested by the back door, as he often did now. His head lifted just enough to track the small, purposeful movements of the toddler as she wandered around the living room with her favorite storybook. When the sound of tires crunching gravel reached the house, Titan's ears perked, but he didn't bark. He rarely did these days. It was as though he knew the difference between familiar and stranger without needing to be told. Rachel wiped her hands on a dish towel and moved toward the front door, Sophie toddling after her. Through the screen door, she saw the outline of her mother's car and the small figure stepping out. Judy Moore had never been a tall woman, but what she lacked in height, she had always made up for in presence. A retired schoolteacher, her opinions were firm, her words precise. She was not a woman easily swayed, and from the beginning she had disapproved of Titan. "I still don't think it's wise, Rachel," she had said more than once. "Pit bulls are unpredictable, especially ones with a history like his. A child Sophie's age shouldn't be anywhere near a dog like that." Rachel had stopped arguing months ago. She understood her mother's fear. It wasn't based on malice. It was based on love, but love could be misguided too. Now, as Judy approached the porch, a tote bag slung over one shoulder, her eyes immediately scanned past Rachel to the large dog lying just inside the door. Titan didn't move. He only watched, his gaze steady but calm. "Hi, Mom," Rachel said, stepping out to meet her. Judy hugged her daughter, then bent down to greet Sophie, who squealed and wrapped small arms around her grandmother's legs. Rachel waited for the inevitable glance back toward Titan. "You didn't tell me he was up and walking again," Judy remarked, straightening. "He's still recovering," Rachel replied. "But yes, he's stronger every day." Judy's gaze lingered on the dog, her brow furrowed not in judgment this time, but in something closer to thoughtfulness. "Can I come in?" she asked softly. Rachel nodded, holding the door open. They moved into the living room. Sophie climbed onto the rug beside Titan without hesitation, patting his back as if to introduce him to her grandmother all over again. Judy sat carefully on the edge of the couch. For a long moment, no one spoke. Rachel watched her mother watching Titan. She could see the internal battle waging behind Judy's eyes, between the old fears and the undeniable evidence in front of her. "I know what you're thinking," Rachel finally said, keeping her voice gentle. "I'm thinking," Judy replied slowly, "that I was wrong." Rachel blinked. "I was so afraid," Judy continued, her hands folding in her lap. "Afraid that his instincts would override his training, that one day, without meaning to, he would hurt Sophie." Titan's ears flicked at the mention of his name, but he remained still. "But then," Judy went on, "I heard the whole story from Dr. Lanford. How he stood between her and that bobcat. How he barked every night, even while injured, to warn you about the snake." Rachel felt her throat tighten. "I thought fear would keep Sophie safe," Judy said quietly. "But it turns out trust kept her safer." Silence filled the room, heavy, but not uncomfortable. Then Judy leaned forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "You know," she said, "when I was a girl, your grandfather used to tell me a story. He said that sometimes certain animals come into our lives not because we choose them, but because they choose us. He said they appear when they're needed most, to protect a child, or to teach a family something they've forgotten." Rachel smiled faintly. She remembered those stories, told in the glow of firelight during camping trips when she was just a child herself. Judy looked down at Sophie, who now rested her head on Titan's shoulder, the picture of perfect, unguarded trust. "Your grandfather said those animals stay as long as they're needed. And sometimes," Judy added, eyes glistening, "they disappear when their work is done." Rachel reached out, placing her hand over her mother's. "I don't think Titan is going anywhere," she said gently. "He didn't just appear to protect Sophie. He chose to stay." Judy nodded slowly, tears spilling over, despite her best efforts to hold them back. "I can see that now." They sat together, 3 generations and a quiet guardian who needed no words to confirm his place in the family. As the morning sun streamed through the window, catching the silver in Judy's hair and the golden light in Titan's eyes, Rachel felt a peace she hadn't known in a long time. The old fears had not vanished with a single conversation, but they had shifted, and sometimes that was enough. By late summer, the cabin settled into a new rhythm. Not the rhythm of healing, that suggested an endpoint, a destination. This was something gentler. A quiet understanding between those who had suffered and those who had chosen to stay. Titan never fully regained the strength he once had. His injured leg healed with a permanent stiffness, and when he walked across the backyard, it was with the slow, deliberate steps of a guardian who knew speed was no longer his weapon. But what he lacked in swiftness, he made up for with an even greater stillness. He wasn't a pet in the way people expected dogs to be. He didn't seek out belly rubs or chase tennis balls. He had no interest in the colorful rope toys that Sophie tried to share with him. Instead, he watched. That was all. Every afternoon, while Sophie played beneath the wide-limbed birch tree, Titan took his place at a measured distance, always just far enough to give her the independence she craved, but never so far that he couldn't reach her if needed. His eyes followed her every movement, her bright yellow sun hat bobbing as she ran between the flower beds, the tiny green watering can she dragged from the porch to sprinkle over the wildflowers, the endless games she invented, narrating them in the language of toddlers that only she and Titan seemed to understand. Neighbors who visited the property commented on how quiet Titan was, how still. "He's like a statue," Mrs. Connolly had said one day, shading her eyes as she watched Sophie and Titan from the garden gate. "Like one of those ancient stone lions guarding a temple." Rachel had smiled. That wasn't far from the truth. In the evenings, when the sun dipped low and painted the sky with strokes of rose and amber, Sophie would climb into Rachel's lap on the porch swing, eyelids heavy with sleep. And always Titan would sit by the screen door, his gaze facing outward toward the darkening forest, watching, waiting. Even as the shadows deepened, he remained at his post. Rachel had come to realize he wasn't watching for threats anymore. Not entirely. He was watching the passage of time itself, guarding not just Sophie's safety, but her childhood. The fleeting, precious hours of innocence he seemed to understand would someday change. That evening, after putting Sophie to bed, Rachel sat alone at the kitchen table with her leather-bound journal open before her. The pages were filled with months of reflections, some scribbled in moments of fear, others in rare moments of peace. "Now," she wrote slowly, choosing her words with care, I used to believe that animals operated on instinct alone. That everything they did, every choice, every reaction, was pre-wired into their DNA. But Titan has shown me otherwise. Instinct may explain why he once ran into danger for a fellow officer. It may explain why he kept Sophie in his line of sight at all times. But instinct alone does not explain what I see now. Titan stays not because he is trained to. Not because he must, but because he chooses to. He has chosen this family. Chosen to protect not just a child, but a home, a future, even when his body aches. Even when the world he once knew, the world of orders and partners and sirens, is gone. This is not instinct. This is loyalty. This is love. This is choice. Rachel paused, the pen hovering above the page, her eyes blurring for a moment. From the living room came the soft creak of the floorboards. Titan. He had risen from his spot by the door and now stood at the threshold of Sophie's room. He didn't enter. He never did. He just stood there, watching, ears slightly forward, tail still. Rachel closed the journal. She stood and crossed the room, kneeling beside him. "You don't have to stay up all night, old boy," she whispered, her fingers brushing the soft fur beneath his collar. "But I know you will anyway." Titan leaned into the touch briefly, then returned to his silent vigil. The night deepened. The air cooled. The sounds of crickets and the distant call of an owl filled the space between waking and sleep. Rachel gathered Sophie from her crib and carried her to the porch swing, wrapping them both in the woven blanket that had once belonged to Noah. The child stirred but didn't wake, curling instinctively against her mother's chest. Titan followed, his limp barely noticeable now in the hush of the evening. He settled at the porch's edge, head held high, eyes reflecting the faint glow of the first stars rising above the treetops. The horizon stretched wide and wild before them. Different species, different worlds, and yet bound together not by ownership or obligation but by a single, unspoken promise. Rachel rested her chin against Sophie's soft curls and closed her eyes, whispering into the quiet night, "Thank you for staying." Titan did not respond. He didn't need to. His presence was the answer. A guardian, a protector, a silent vow. As darkness embraced the forest, Titan kept watch over the only world that mattered now. His family. As the sun set behind the Wyoming hills, Titan did not just guard a child. He guarded innocence. He guarded hope. And most of all, he guarded the belief that loyalty is a choice, not a command. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to comment below. Share if you've ever known an animal who became more than a pet, who became family. Subscribe to our channel. Each subscription helps us bring more heartfelt, meaningful stories like this to life. Your support is not just a number. It is the reason we can continue creating stories that heal, inspire, and remind us of what truly matters. We make a living by what we get, but we make a life by what we give. Winston Churchill. Thank you for being part of this journey.